There's a lie at the center of modern spirituality about Thoth, and it's not a malicious lie, it's a lie of comfort. The lie is this, that Thoth calls you, that he chooses you, activates you, gently elevates you into an expanded version of who you already are. It took me time to name how much that idea cost me, not because it was false, but because it was true in the wrong way. True enough to be consumed, false enough to keep you exactly where you are. Because what the traditions that created the name Thoth recorded across 5,000 years is not a god who elevates, it's a process that forces rupture, not an invitation, a rupture. And this video is not going to give you an activation. It's going to give you something harder, the real structure behind what the Hermetic traditions called Thoth, and what that means specifically for someone who made it here looking for something more than consumable spiritual content. If you're here looking for confirmation that you're already special, stop here. This is not the right video. If you're here because you sense that something in the spiritual systems you've consumed isn't delivering what it promised, keep going, because what comes next was built for you. To understand what Thoth really represents, you need to compress 5,000 years into a single line that rarely appears this way. Thoth first appears in Egyptian records as the scribe of the gods, the one who records the judgment of Osiris, the one who weighs the souls. Not a god of supernatural powers, a god of precision and confrontation with what is. The scribe doesn't invent, he records what's there. 1,500 years later, the same principles resurface in the Hermetic papyri circulating through the Hellenistic Mediterranean. The name shifts to Hermes Trismegistus, and the first text of the Corpus Hermeticum, the Poimandres, opens not with a promise, but with a question from the narrator himself. What do you wish to know and learn? And then begins a dialogue where what is revealed is not a list of powers, but the structure of reality confronted directly by a consciousness willing to look without a filter. In the Florentine Renaissance, when Cosimo de' Medici orders the Hermetic texts translated with extraordinary urgency, before even Plato, what the translators find is not a manual for easy ascension. It's an ontology of transformation that assumes as its fundamental condition the dissolution of the ordinary self. There is a line running through all of these points, and it says something that contemporary spirituality about Thoth almost never says in every context where the Hermetic principle was transmitted with fidelity. Egyptian, Greco-Roman, Islamic, Renaissance, the central mechanism was not the granting of power. It was the exposure of what was hidden. Hidden not in the universe, in you. You probably already knew some of these references. What you may not have named yet is what they have in common, and why this 5,000-year pattern has something to say about what's happening in your own process right now. I'm going to make a counterintuitive promise. I'm not going to give you an Atlantean DNA activation. I'm not going to guide you through pyramids of light or Akashic downloads. What this video is going to deliver is more uncomfortable than that, and also more lasting. I'm going to show you what the Hermetic traditions actually taught about the process they called Thoth. Not the version that sells, the version that transforms. And the difference between the two is a difference in cost. The version that sells asks nothing of you beyond your attention. The version that transforms requires that you be willing to lose something, not your life, not your relationships, not your material security, the narrative you call your spiritual self, the identity built around beliefs about who you are, why you came here, what you deserve to receive, the version of you that feels validated every time you find content that confirms you're special, that you were chosen, that your awakening is imminent. Thoth, in the traditions that originated him, does not activate that version, he dissolves it. That is the real promise. And before continuing, it needs to be clear, because what comes next only makes sense if you accept that this is the price, not as punishment, as the only way to access what the Hermetic traditions actually preserved. What does it mean concretely that Thoth dissolves identity? It's too abstract to be useful as it stands. Let me make it specific. There's a documented pattern in traditions of real transmission, not consumable spiritual content, but structured initiation, Sufi, Kabbalistic, alchemical, Rosicrucian. The pattern is this. Before any genuine transmission of knowledge, the initiate passes through what the traditions call the nigredo, darkening, dissolution, a crisis with no apparent way out. In Latin, putrefactio, the necessary rot before the new form. Carl Jung systematized this in the 20th century as individuation, the process by which the psyche confronts what was repressed until the mask, the persona, the identity constructed to function in the world stops being protection and becomes a prison. What these traditions document, without exception, is that the nigredo is not a stage you pass through and leave behind. It is the mechanism itself. The process has no clean ending. It recurs. Each time the identity reconstructs itself around something new, including around a more elaborate spiritual identity, the mechanism can return. So the direct answer, yes, the activation of Thoth is real. It has been documented, practiced, transmitted consistently in traditions that never had contact with each other. And here is the question that answer opens, the one that will accompany the rest of this video and that will not resolve on its own. If the mechanism is dissolution, if what the process does is force the crisis that breaks the constructed identity, then what specifically is being dissolved in you right now? This is not a rhetorical question. It is the question that matters. Stop for a second. There is something you have been assuming without realizing you were assuming it. A premise that has run through this entire video, and probably through all the spiritual content you've consumed in recent months without ever being explicitly named. The premise is this, that spiritual awakening is a process of addition, that you are going to add consciousness, clarity, connection, power, that you will become more, that the experience of awakening is fundamentally the experience of gaining something that was missing. All the language of contemporary spirituality was built on top of this premise. Activations, downloads, frequency upgrades, expanded DNA, all of these words presuppose addition, that something new will be inserted into what you already are, making you a more complete version of yourself. But this premise is exactly what the original Hermetic traditions identify as the greatest obstacle to any real transmission. You cannot receive what the process represents while you are still trying to add to what you already are. The transmission happens in the space that opens when something is removed, not when something is added. You weren't looking for transformation, you were looking for confirmation. This is not a criticism. It is the recognition of something simply human, the search for validation of who you already believe yourself to be. But it is precisely this movement that the Hermetic process was built to interrupt. And now that this premise has been named, it won't let the rest of this video be consumed the way it was before. Let's step out of myth and into mechanism. Because when you understand the mechanism, the myth stops being an optional belief and becomes a functional map. Thoth in the original Hermetic texts is described as the one who knows what is hidden beneath the vault of heaven and beneath the earth. Popular spirituality translated this as Thoth has access to cosmic knowledge, but the text says something more specific. He knows what is hidden because he has access to what ordinary consciousness refuses to see. Here is the mechanism that phrase is describing. Human consciousness in its ordinary state operates through filters, not out of weakness, out of functional necessity. The volume of information the nervous system processes every second is incompatible with total conscious attention. The filters select what is relevant to survival, to the coherence of the self-narrative, to the maintenance of the identity the subject has constructed over time. And here is the point that changes everything. The filters are not a problem to be corrected. They are the condition of ordinary functioning. The Hermetic question was never how to eliminate the filters. It was what are they hiding that you would need to see in order to understand who you actually are. This distinction matters. Initiation is not a state of perception without limits. It is a temporary confrontation with what was being filtered. What the Hermetic traditions call initiation is a process of temporary suspension of those filters, not to grant supernatural powers, to expose what the filters were hiding from conscious perception. And what they hide, documented across multiple traditions over millennia, is not external cosmic secrets. It is the patterns of the initiate's own identity, the structures that hold it together, the contradictions it refuses to integrate, what it needs to believe in order to keep being what it is. Thoth as mechanism is that process of exposure, not an entity that grants clarity from the outside in. It is the name the tradition gave to the clarity that emerges when the filters are suspended long enough for what was being filtered to become visible to the very consciousness that was filtering it. What took me time to understand, and what I still find difficult to formulate, without it sounding simpler than it is that this process is not comfortable because it is not supernatural. It is real, and the real, when seen without a filter for the first time, is rarely what we expected it to be. The question this raises, the one the argument is pointing to but hasn't yet fully named, is what the next moment will reveal. And here is what no Hermetic activation video will say. Because saying it means losing an audience. It means pushing away everyone who came looking for comfort. And the spiritual marketplace, like any marketplace, has quickly learned what can be said without the cost of loss. The mechanism of Thoth, the process of suspending filters, of exposing what was hidden, does not live in your Atlantean DNA. It is not encoded in sacred geometry. It is not transmitted through guided meditations, pyramids of light, or frequency downloads. It lives in your capacity to bear witness to what you actually are, not what your spiritual identity says you are, what you are when the narrative of yourself is removed. This is the point of no return. Because you came to this video carrying, on some level, the expectation that there would be a revelation that confirmed who you already are, a piece of information that would fit into the spiritual identity you've built. Content that would say, yes, you are exactly what you feel you are, and now there is a Hermetic authority confirming that. What Thoth represents in the traditions that originated him is the opposite process. It is the confrontation with what you have avoided naming about yourself. The aspect of your identity that the spiritual narrative was built to cover, not to reveal. I'm not talking about collapse, not about existential crisis without ground. I'm talking about a specific question, one you have already encountered before, that appeared in moments of silence, in difficult conversations, in late nights without clear context, that you recognized as important and let pass before answering completely. You know which one it is. I don't need to name it for you. And the fact that you know which one it is, that is Thoth operating now, not as an entity waiting to be recognized, as process, as the pressure that won't let the comfortable answer be sufficient for the question that is actually being asked. There is a contrast that defines two types of people who come into contact with Hermeticism, and the contrast matters more than any specific Hermetic teaching. The first type uses Hermeticism as identity construction. They accumulate symbols, language, rituals, affiliations. They learn to speak about the Hermetic laws, the Akashic records, Thoth and Isis, and the pillars of the temple. The spiritual identity grows, becomes elaborate, sophisticated, convincing to themselves and to others. Mysticism functions as an extension of the ego, not as pressure on it. This person has real experiences, genuine meditations, synchronicities that cannot simply be dismissed. And they have genuine knowledge. They know the 42 principles of Ma'at, know the Kybalion, can explain the Emerald Tablet with reasonable precision. But when a behavioral pattern repeats for the 10th time, they explain it with spiritual language instead of examining it. When someone close points out a contradiction between what they say they believe and how they act, the reaction is defensiveness, not curiosity. When an important relationship ends, they return to the same emotional strategies as always, with new Hermetic vocabulary layered on top. They remain structurally the same person, with a more interesting vocabulary, with a more elaborate identity, with the same unanswered question now better hidden beneath layers of sophisticated spiritual language. The second type finds in Hermeticism not a belief system to add to themselves, but a pressure that won't let the hard questions be dismissed by spiritual language, that forces the confrontation between what they say they believe and how they act, that won't allow a spiritual identity to function as a substitute for real inner work. This second type rarely has an elaborate spiritual identity. They have a process, incomplete, non-linear, sometimes painful, almost never gratifying in the way the spiritual marketplace promises, but something changes, something that can't be described in terms of powers or activations, but that is perceptible to those who are close to them. Which of the two are you? Don't answer quickly. The quick answer will be the most favorable one. The honest answer will take a moment longer than is comfortable to hold. And if you felt a resistance to the question, if there was an impulse to answer second type before you finished reading the description of the first, that, specifically, is information about where you actually are. Let me be direct about what this video has been building toward. The Hermetic history was not here to impress with erudition. It was installing a perception. There is a real mechanism, documented across 5,000 years, present in cultures that never had contact with each other. Not a belief, a pattern. The counterintuitive promise created a specific tension between what you were looking for and what the real process offers. That tension was not decorative, it was the argument itself. The hidden premise named the only real obstacle, seeking confirmation instead of confrontation. The contrast between the two types positioned you in relation to the mechanism, not as an abstract concept, but as a choice that is already alive. Everything has converged. There is something about Thoth, about the mechanism itself, that once said clearly, cannot be undone. It is no longer information to be added to what you already know. It is a reorientation. If this video has done something real up to this point, you're already feeling the weight of what comes next, not as fear, as the recognition of something you already knew that was present even before this video began and that now has enough form to be named. Here is the mechanism that was hidden beneath everything. Thoth was never an external entity waiting for your recognition, never a frequency to tune into, never a god waiting for you to become worthy of his activation. Thoth is the name the Hermeticists gave to the process of consciousness confronting its own limits until something breaks. Not a breaking of suffering, a breaking of structure. The structure that holds together the narrative of the self with its specific fears, its specific strategies, its specific version of what is true about you and about the world. The narrative that selects what is perceived and filters out what contradicts what has already been decided about who you are. When that structure breaks, not through external collapse, but through the accumulated pressure of internal honesty, what emerges has no name in popular spiritual vocabulary. It is not a power. It is not a spectacular vision. It is not a download of information from the cosmos. It is the capacity to perceive what was there all along, before the filters. The Hermeticists called this Gnosis, not knowledge about something, direct knowledge of. And what they documented in every tradition that preserved this process with fidelity is this: Gnosis is not an addition to what you are. It is what remains when what you built as yourself has been sufficiently questioned. Thoth is the process of questioning that won't let the narrative reinstall itself before being completely examined, not as punishment, as the condition of access. And what this means for you specifically is the following. Every time you felt that your spiritual belief system couldn't explain something you were actually living through, every time the language of chosen initiate sounded on some internal level slightly false, but you kept going because the comfort was worth the small falseness. Every time you had the sense of becoming more elaborate spiritually, but not necessarily more honest with yourself, you were feeling exactly that, the process in operation, the pressure that won't let the comfortable answer be sufficient for what the real question demands. That is the mechanism. That was always the mechanism. And there is a question this mechanism raises, one this video will not answer. Because to answer it would be to steal from you what is yours. And it is this: what exists on the other side of dissolution? What do the Hermetic traditions describe as what emerges after the constructed self has broken sufficiently? That question stays with you now. If something in this video created pressure, not comfort, not validation, but a question that doesn't close easily, then it accomplished what it came to do. If there is something that remained unresolved, write it in the comments, not a reaction to the video. The specific question the process raised that you still don't know how to answer with complete honesty. That precision will be useful when the next video in this series arrives, because the next step will depend on where each person is standing, not on where the script wants everyone to be. If this line of investigation, the real structure behind what the Hermetic traditions taught, without the comfort systems that obscured it, is what you're looking for, this channel will continue this work. Subscribe if you don't want to miss the next step. Thoth as process does not end with a video. What you experienced here, if it was real and not just intellectually interesting, will not resolve in the next few hours. It may generate the opposite of resolution, the sense that something that was comfortable has become a little less comfortable than it was before, that a narrative that was working well is beginning to show edges that previously went unnoticed, that the question you left unanswered for months is starting to refuse to be put off any longer. This is not a sign of a problem, it is the mechanism working. What the Hermetic traditions document is that the process of exposure Thoth represents does not have an initial phase of illumination, it has an initial phase of disorientation. The disorientation of someone who has realized that the map they were using was not a map of the actual territory, it was a map of what they wanted the territory to be. This is the genuine starting point of any real Hermetic initiation, not the comfortable activation. The recognition that the map was wrong, and that even with the wrong map, You made it here. What the traditions document next, and what is rarely transmitted with honesty, is that disorientation is not the final state. It is the state of transition. And what emerges after has a name in the primary sources, has structure, has precedent in cultures that arrived at the same point by paths that never crossed. This is what the next video will explore, what the Hermetic traditions describe as the other side of rupture. What emerges when the constructed self is sufficiently questioned for something deeper to become visible, not as a vague mystical experience, but as a documented state, with the same precision that Thoth as mechanism was documented here. This is not a promise that the other side is easy. It is the affirmation that it exists and that it has enough form to be investigated, not merely felt. The question has been planted, and it is already working.